Hey friends, it's Marie at Living Felt, and today we are breaking down felting needles. One of the most common questions we get is to understand what the different types of felting needles are for, or what are their best uses, or sometimes people just want to know what types of felting needles do they have in their own stash, because maybe they got them with a kit, or maybe they got them from someone other than us and they weren't color coded. And if that sounds like you, keep on watching, because that's what we're going to break down in today's show. So be sure to hit the subscribe button and click that bell so you get notified every time we upload a new video, and we're going to dive into this one.
Yes.
Nomi's going to help us out today. So thank you all for being here. I'm trying to read some of your comments. So as part of the live show, we asked for you all to give us ideas of what you wanted for Q&A, and this is a topic that comes up all the time. If you saw our description for the show today, if you saw our description for the show, you know that we tried to record this last year, but we didn't have great success. We actually had technical difficulties on that day. Yeah, and the show didn't stick. So thank you all for joining us. And I hope that you brought your felting needles with you, whether you got them from us or you got them from somewhere else. We're going to try and help you make sense of the needles you have. And I was thinking today, prior to today's show, that I think felting needles, I was trying to think of an analogy, and I think they're a little like an emery board. So, if you ever get one of those kind of crappy brown emery boards that somebody, I don't know, maybe it comes like free in something and you feel like it doesn't file anything. But if that's all you had, you could file a big old dog toenail with it. You know what I mean? If you had to, you'd chip away at it. And if sometimes you have one that's just way too aggressive, it's maybe made for the woolly mammoth toenails. Use it on your finger and it tears your finger up. And I think felting needles are kind of like that. So sometimes you just got to use what you have. But if you have a few more options, then the key thing will be to play with them and make your best assessments by trying them on what you're doing. So we're going to look at the different size felting needles that we have, and we're also going to try and help you sort the ones that you have. First, we're just going to look right here, a real broad look at our felting needles. And this is not the super zoomed in view, but we're going to do that. So Kayla held up our felting needles pack. And we sell currently 10 different sizes of felting needles. Ours are color coded, and we color code them except for the 38s, and that's just kind of been our history. So our needles are color coded. Blue is a 32, and we're going to go through the different ways you might talk about a felting needle, but the blue is a 32 triangle, the pink is a 36 triangle. We have 3 plain 38s. That's a triangle, a star, and a spiral. We have a 40 triangle and a 40 spiral, and then a 42 triangle, and then 2 reverse needles. So we're going to look at all of those today. And even if you don't have those, we'll try and help you make sense of the ones that you do have. So when we talk about felting needles, we might talk about them as coarse, medium, fine, and these are all the fine, and reverse. That's one way you might classify your needles. And that's if you have unmarked needles, you don't know what they are. If you have unmarked needles and you don't know what they are, that's the first thing I want you to think about is coarse, medium, fine, and then reverse. And of course, there's different variations in the reverse as well. But then the other way is to talk about their shape. So we're going to zoom in here and just for a moment get super, super, super duper close and show you what to look for in your own felting needle so you can start to make sense of whether it is fine or coarse, or even whether it's a triangle, a star, or a spiral. Really, really, really close now. So I know this is going to be a little crazy at first, but what I want you to do here is look for the light reflection. I am holding a triangle needle, and a triangle needle has 3 flat sides. So you should be able to see the light reflecting off those 3 flat sides. If your needle kind of looks like this when you rotate it, it's a triangle, most likely. Now the next easiest one to recognize is a spiral. And you're going to see the difference right here. A spiral, as you rotate it, you can see the light running up and down the shaft in the spiral. So those two are really easy to tell apart. Now, a star is a little more challenging, but if you had a magnifying glass or something, it'd be a little bit easier to pick out. A star is sort of like a triangle, except each side has a ridge running down it. So I'm going to hold it next to my triangle and try and get it as close as I can here. And the star needle has like a groove running down the shaft here, and then the barbs are put on the edge of that, on the edges of the groove. So it's like the flat side. Let me zoom out just a little bit here. That's okay. Let me go, I'll go here. The flat side, imagine this is a flat side, kind of goes like this. So whereas normally a flat side would have a groove along the edge, a star kind of dips in like this and the grooves are along that edge. So that's the basic difference between a triangle, a spiral, and a star in what they look like.
Juliet says, wow, I can totally tell it's a triangle on the screen.
Good. Yeah, so sorry we had to get like sickeningly close there. So we won't be that close in probably for most of today, but we will when we start looking at how to get rid of poke marks or whatever you want to call them, pock marks. So what do you care, the difference that it's a triangle, a spiral, or a star? The thing I'll tell you is that triangle traditionally has been the most common. And then the star was designed to be a little more aggressive. So if you have a 36 triangle and a 36 star, the star is going to be more aggressive. And if you have a spiral, the spiral was designed to be as aggressive as a star, but with less impact as far as a visual hole left in the project. And so as you poke in, it twists, and that twist, I think what it does is it kind of varies where the compression happens as you twist, rather than just being in like the hooks, the barbs on the felting needles. You can see them better on the really coarse needles. It's like a hook on it, and it pushes down the wool. And I think as you have a spiral, then it kind of grabs different areas of the surface that you're compacting. So it's designed to leave less of a mark. So all that said, the truth is you got what you got, and they may be color coded and they may be not. So we want to help you kind of make sense of them, and that's what we're going to look at today. Cool? Okay, so I brought just some fluff with me and just some core wool rather than a felted piece, and then we're going to look at some felted pieces too. But if you have needles that you're trying to make sense of, the first thing I'll have you do is just grab a little fluff of wool, and don't even needle felt it yet. Just kind of wad it up. So we're just going to do this, and then why don't we go top down, look overhead, and we're going to zoom that in a little bit so you can kind of see what's happening. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to start with a fine needle. Pick up any needle that you have on your table that you don't know what it is. And if you have this big loose fluff of wool without even compressing it, just start to poke it. Notice how it feels. Mine will poke all the way through to the table without effort. It'll poke all the way through to the table, but notice you don't hear any noise when I poke into it. I can just kind of go into the wool and you don't hear anything. It's just gliding all the way in. It feels like I'm doing nothing. That's what I expect of a fine needle. So I'm going to pick up a coarse needle. Not my coarsest, just a coarse needle. And as I poke the wool, and I'll kind of poke in the same place, notice, if you will, notice how it's compressing that fiber and not just like driving all the way through. It's taking a lot of wool with it as I poke. It's not real satisfying to use a coarse needle on a loose fluff of wool. It feels like nothing is happening. I'll go to a coarser needle. Oh, same thing. Like if you poke in the loose areas, it'll poke in a little bit, but if you tap with a coarse needle, and maybe we'll go, let's try an across close. If you tap something with a coarse needle, it kind of also feels like nothing is happening. If this is your action, if this tends to be your action, a coarse needle won't be very satisfying. But if you drive the wool instead, I'm looking for a piece of foam. I have one, so I don't poke my finger. I don't usually hold and poke wool. But if you use a driving action when you felt with a coarse needle, drive, meaning like you're going to do a solid effort push towards the center, you'll feel it move more wool. So the first way to start to tell whether your needles are, just think of them as coarse, medium, or fine, is to start to poke them into some loose wool and see how it feels. If it feels like it's, catches on a lot of wool and requires more of that pushing motion, put it in what you would consider your coarse pile. Medium ones, if they're a 38, they're a medium. They're grabbing onto the wool, and we can go top down if you want. They're grabbing onto the wool, but they're not getting too much resistance. It's actually moving some wool. It's kind of satisfying. If you like to needle felt loose fluff, a single medium felting needle may be very satisfying because it does grab a little bit of wool as you work. So now I'm using a spiral. And I can feel that the spiral is more aggressive than the triangle that I just had. You can feel it's poking more wool in. And then this is the star. So the star is going to be just as aggressive, but probably leave a little more of a mark. So if you're just trying to figure out if you have a needle that's medium, fine, or coarse, start by poking it into some loose wool. What I'm going to tell you is that like a 38 triangle and a 40 triangle in this type of environment are going to feel very similar. I always say that a 38 triangle is on the fine side of medium. I think of it as being on the fine side of medium, whereas the star and the spiral are on the coarse side of a medium needle. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so a 38 triangle is on the fine side of medium. So a 38 triangle and a 40 triangle may feel very similar, and there's the sweet spot of a fine needle is really in more shallow work. The same, if anything finer than a 42 is really in more shallow work, like when you're refining something like this, like our little gnome guy, and you don't want to see needle marks. So that's the quick of it, is to poke it into a loose piece of wool. But I also want you to poke it into a piece of wool that's already felted a little bit, whether it's a ball that's kind of started or one that's already done. A coarse needle will make great holes and lines. So can you see in this dark? I'm going to poke. A coarse needle, you can you see that indent? A coarse needle is really going to make a great indent, whether you want a line or a hole. That's what a coarse needle will do. They'll really help you get some definition. A medium needle, like a 38, is not going to have as much of an impact. It's going to take more of your effort to do, but you can still do it. And notice that I'm really poking these needles in. I'm not tacking. I'm not tacking like this. And this, I think needle choice is also going to depend on your style. When I first started needle felting, I didn't have a lot of needles, and I did a lot of just bouncy poke, bouncy poke, bouncy poke. But when I do a coarse needle, I tend to use it only in the driving stage to really compact something. Like this ball is really pretty well felted. I am squishing it with all the strength I have in my fingers, and it's not smushing out to nothing. So I'll use 38s and 32s to form a solid foundation of something. Coarse needles make a nice solid structure, and I do that by rolling something very tightly. I will roll something very tightly and get all the air out of it first, and then I'll use my coarse needle on it to keep the compaction that I made with my fingers. Does that make sense? First, I'm compacting the wool, which is what we're doing when we're felting. We are compacting it, and then we are entangling it. We're doing both. So if you do some of the compaction with your fingers first, then you can use a coarse needle to hold that in place. But notice that if I were to just bounce, I'm going nowhere. I'm just on the surface. To use this needle well, drive it into the center, I'll sound like a broken record, to the center, to the center. Funny how I say the same thing when we're wet felting over resist. Rub to the center, to the center. So the action of a coarse needle, in my opinion, is more of a driving action, like this. It's a little more like a sledgehammer, like you pick it up and you whack it, as opposed to a little finishing hammer, tack, 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 kind of like that. So this to me is the sweet spot for a coarse needle, and that is to really make fast work of a solid foundation. And you can also use them in a needle tool, like this is a single needle tool. If that's more comfortable for you, you can use one at a time. And then you can also use needle tools, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at a time. It just depends. If you're working on something small, use a one needle, hold it with your hand, or use a holder, or you can use a needle holder like this one. Now this one has two spirals in it. And what I think is really interesting when you're making shapes is how you can take a single needle or more of a finer needle and sometimes feel like you're achieving similar results. Like this is two spirals. If you put a whole bunch of 36s or 32s together in a tool and cluster them, you get a lot of resistance, and there's so many things are pushing down on the wool that it doesn't even want to go in. So if you're trying to speed up work by using more needles, and you poke and the wool just doesn't want to receive the needle, then go to a finer gauge needle. Try a 38 spiral, which is, I often load my tools with a 38 spiral for building up foundations. Okay, anything to interrupt me with?
Yeah, we've got a couple questions. Firstly, everybody is jumping for joy with this topic.
Oh, good.
My goodness, everyone is so excited.
Oh, good.
Angie says, thank you loads. Martha says, thank you so much for going through the different needles. Marlene says, oh my gosh, I just got the needle pack. It's so exciting to learn about each. Cindy asks, does the length of the needle have an impact?
That's it. So Cindy asked about the length of the needle. Now, in the past, we've had needles that maybe had a longer body here. But if you look at them, what really matters is the shaft. But the length of that shaft where the needles are, and I think that they're very comparable from manufacturer to manufacturer. But I think what's most important is when you're building up shapes, no matter what length your shaft is, you only want unfelted wool no deeper than the shaft length. Usually for me it's less than that. Usually it's, the layers you're felting are only this much at a time. So you make a wrap and you just want the shaft to be able to get all the way through to the middle. So you don't want more wool than that shaft can handle. If you want a really firm foundation, then build it up layer by layer by layer and just optimize the shaft in whatever needles you have. Good question. Thanks. Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the medium needles. Sorry, I'm a creaky chair today. So I brought in a couple of tools here. This is our brand new tool. I know some of y'all have been waiting for it. We're calling it the Punch It tool. It is a beautiful walnut. It's not stained. This is its natural color, so it should get nice and burnished from your hand oils over time. You can use you can use any needles all by themselves. Sometimes you're going to want to use them in a tool. Like all of these tools I have loaded with medium needles. I have 3 together, and what I like is how close the needles are together. I have 2 in this one, and I have 4 in this one and 8 in this one. So this tool holds up to 8 needles. So I encourage you to play with how many needles you put in your tool, depending on what you're making, what you're doing for yourself. So we're going to turn down real quick, and I just want to show you. Okay, so this tool is loaded with 8 needles, and I want you to notice, even notice how my foam looks when I poke on it. Can you see that? Like I'm poking on my foam. Yeah. You can see, it's not going in. I mean, I could jab it through to the table, but there's a lot of resistance, whereas this one will go right in. Like I'm pushing these two with the same amount of effort. And so just a moment ago, I was talking about that surface tension. This many needles all together is going to give you a lot of surface tension. Actually, I'm looking at these. These are really, these are coarse needles. So a good explanation. I can tell they're a 32 or a 36. So this is really coarse, and you're getting a lot of surface tension. So if you're doing this and you're not really satisfied with the results, even though you have this thing loaded, then either go to a finer needle or put less needles in there. And notice like how effective it is and how satisfying it is. It should feel good to needle felt. It should feel good. So if you're not loving it, look, this one is loaded with 8 42 triangles. I want to tell you that you will probably find this loaded with 42s every bit as satisfying for doing some kind of work like this. It's going to flatten it without going all the way through to the middle of the foam. And that's because the 42 triangle needles have very small notches in them, and they also have some very close to the surface. So let's look at the fine needles a little bit, and we'll look at kind of the sweet spot of them. Here's a 42. A 40. The green is a 40. The purple is a 40 spiral. And then I have a 42 triangle, which lots of you know is really a go-to needle for me. What I want to tell you about fine needles is they're really good for your last layers, your last surface layers, and your refinements as you're working on a piece. I don't know if you can see this. I am going to try and turn them at an angle, see if you can see. Like, I can feel that I'm poking into this guy, and I can hear it too. Mm. This is a 40 triangle, and it's going to leave chalk marks in something that I have felted all this well. A 40 spiral is going to feel kind of as aggressive. It's an interesting thing. So it's going to feel as aggressive, but it should leave a slightly less noticeable needle mark. And if you're trying to refine something and get it really smooth, that's when you want to pull out your fine needles, your 42. And the reason is you can lightly tack the surface and just compress the wool gradually. And I often do this in the last, sometimes 20% of a piece, because I'm just kind of nerdy and I like to spend time smoothing something out. So I'll just go over this entire hat and just lightly tack it from many different angles. So turn your piece around. So you're going from many different angles so that you are smoothing out the entire area. So we're going to zoom in one more level for this guy. I think we'll do it over here. So we can kind of zoom in a little bit. See, where can I go? Okay, so I'm going to look at this up close a little bit. Can you kind of see the pockmarks? I can't see that far away. Can you see the pockmarks a little bit? Okay. The thing I want you to think about as you're working on your pieces, and women, we're probably guilty of this, but guilty of this meaning looking like at our own faces on super hyper zoom in the mirror and then scrutinizing every little wrinkle or every little pore. I think there's a danger in doing that to our felting also. So remember that most of your pieces are going to be viewed from at least 6 inches back. You're not going to get rid of every little pore, if you will, in the fiber without wet felting it, and I don't wet felt my needle felted pieces. So try and get everything uniform. When I think of smoothing pieces, I think of usually people want to get rid of the holes. And what I tell people is don't think about getting rid of the holes so much as compressing all the other wool to that level. And it's the one reason I stop using an aggressive needle early on. So rather than think about getting rid of the holes, I'm going to needle felt everything that's sticking up past the hole and making that look like a hole. Just think of that wool as being compressed already, as being felted already, and you want to get everything else kind of down to that level if possible. And for that, I'm just barely tacking with my 42 triangle needle. So the 42 all by itself is really great for surface design, and you can also go really shallow, like shallow angles like this. Get really intimate with your piece and get as close to it as feels comfortable for you. But the 42 is just a really nice surface needle. Get everything compressed. And then if you want to rub it, you should be able to rub it without the fiber coming off. If you rub it and you could pick that fiber off like that, it's not done. So keep compressing it. So I'm going to show you this little cluster tool. I was turned on to this by Jennifer Field. It's 3 42 triangles together. Sometimes I use 5 or 4, but this is actually a great shaping tool. I know that she likes to use it for finishing, and you can lightly tack for finishing, or you can push it to shape something. Now I like to use it on something that's already compressed a little bit, but it will really move a lot of wool. So don't, if you feel like all your needles are fine, don't despair. Cluster what you have together and then see how well you can actually move wool with a bunch of them banded together, even if all you have is a rubber band. Everybody can get a rubber band. So you don't have to have these fancy tools, but if you want them, we got them. Okay, so the other thing, that's a shaping tool, and that's what medium needles are great for too, are for shaping things. So besides like this big blob, let me pull in, this is just a little test guy I've kind of been working on, and this is a 38 star that I'm working with. So a 38 star you can test it and see, will it do what you're wanting, like to shape my trunk. I'll kind of bend. This is my baby elephant. I meant to give him eyes before the show, but that didn't happen. If you poke something and it feels like it just wants to give, go to a finer needle. If you're poking something and it feels like it just wants to move away from the needle, go to a finer needle. So I'll go with a spiral even. Feels the same. I'll go to a 40 triangle. Better. So just think about that. If the needle just wants to move away from it, then try a finer needle. If it's not having the impact that you want, like here, I'm going to give this guy some eye holes. That's what a coarse needle is good for. I mean, look how much it just moves that wool out of the way instantly, because it grabs so much with every poke. So this is a sledgehammer right here. And a 38, oh, sorry, where am I? Sorry, y'all. A 38 is more like an everyday hammer. So this thing will really move a lot of wool. And this is just my 36 triangle. It's not even the 32. So usually what we do is if you start with a 32, when it feels like the wool is just too resistant for it, then you move up to a 36. When it feels too resistant for it, move up to the next one. Okay? So, what's that? You want to ask me something? Oh no, that's okay. So why don't we look at what questions do you have? Yeah, Anne, what do you got?
Do felting needles dull over time?
Oh, that's a great question. That is a question that we get asked a lot. And here's the thing I want you to think about. Felting needles, if used in wool, like what they were designed to, are going to last you a long, long time. They're designed for industry. They're designed for, I don't even know how many punches, but they're not designed for poking these little things, However, they're designed for compressing large amounts of product and making commercial bats. So if they're used with wool, they're really not going to dull over time. But if you're driving them through canvas and rigid materials, things that are going to kind of abrade the barbs, then I would say they're going to dull over time. So if it's not working for you, try a different needle. But if one needle just starts to go bad, then you might just switch it out. Okay? Any other questions we should address? If you're finding any of this is helpful to you, even if you're watching the YouTube playback, we hope that you'll leave a comment down below and let us know what your tips are. If you have more questions, we hope that you'll post them so that we can answer them. And I know we need to look at the reverse needle, so we're going to do that. And I brought in my buddy Scout here to help us with that. So this is Scout, and he's just a little friend that I brought along to help out. He wanted to come just for the show today. So this little guy is needle felted just on wool felt. It's our regular 1 millimeter wool felt that we sell in the shop. And this goofy guy I just freehanded for you. He's made with our MC1 batting, which is all a short fiber. And you can see under the muzzle here that it's a little bit dark. when I put that on, I put on just a little bit of white, and I liked how dark it showed there because that's often how it is in a dog's muzzle. So if you look at the back, you can see that I had put a patch of dark underneath. This is all white, and then the dark ear, right? So this is dark underneath the white muzzle. And one of the nice things about a reverse felting needle, besides just making things fuzzy, is to pull up color from the underneath side. So if you're working on a sculpture, whether you're working on a sculpture or a picture, what you can do when you poke in a reverse needle, it pulls wool up. And so we're just going to pull up some little specks here in our dog muzzle. I don't know where they all go. It would be easy for me to do too many. But see how that's coming up there? Does it show on the camera?
It does.
Okay, yeah. So we're pulling up dark colors, and you can keep going into the same area if you want to pull up more of that. So this is just to, like, as an example, to pull up one color through another, and you might even use that as a blending technique. Now you may not want it to be fuzzy, so you can just trim it off, and then after you trim it off, you kind of see his little muzzle. Looks a little more natural than putting down black polka dots. And this is a little more of an extreme example. I made a great big mound under there, and all I did was pull up this one, yeah, like our darkest gray, just pull that up through the top. And you can do the same thing with an opposite color. I don't know how well this one will show. This was meant to be, I was doing like a little snow beachscape. I was inspired by the Google Doodle the other day.
I saw that one.
It was like wintry. And so I thought, well, you could also pull stars out of the sky if you wanted to, pull little white flecks up out of a black sky, and just keep pulling from the same area if you want, the same spot if you want to pull a little more color through. Now I'm working with the 36, which is the most aggressive. I'm doing the 36, which is the most aggressive, and it will depend on what fiber you put underneath. This is just our merino this is our MC1 batting. But you can see how we got some little specks in the sky. And they're real mild, I have to tell you. Like, for years we didn't carry these needles because we know that they don't have great big impacts. But like for my little elephant here, I put, and this may be very hard to see, I might see if we can get like a little light background. Underneath his head, I put, I'm going to be able to say it, yak. I put yak underneath his head. And so right now, all I'm doing is just pulling out that yak, which is pretty short. It's about 1 inch long, but I wanted to give him a real fuzzy head. Did you see that baby elephant that was born recently? Or pictures, you didn't see it? This adorable baby elephant. And so he really inspired me. And so I wanted to make a little pin. Oh, I need to come in. Just tell me, Hen, I can't see. Okay, so now I'm just pulling up these little, can you see? Now he's got a little frock that he didn't have before. And you can trim it, so that it's not too wispy. I could have used New Zealand Corriedale or something a little more long. This stuff, like I said, is just 1 inch, and I wanted him to have just a little fuzzy frock on his head. And so these reverse needles aren't in place of putting long fur on something. They are really just to fuzz out something, and it's going to help if what you have is already compacted. Does that make sense? Okay, so what other questions can I answer? What other questions can we answer about felting needles before we go? Because this is just sort of the quick of it. So first, if you can recognize whether you have a triangle, a spiral, or a star, great. And then I would say to start with whether something is coarse, medium, or fine, and see if you can get them into a bucket. Again, ours are color-coded except for the 38s, and those are pretty easy to tell apart once you know what they are. You're going to have your go-tos also, just like you do in your knife drawer at home. You probably have your go-to knives that you use for everything, and felting needles will kind of be the same. And I have a collection of things that are like my go-tos that I use all the time. What do we got, Anne?
Karen asks, are there different sizes of the reverse needle?
There are. So we carry a 36 and a 38, and the one that I was just demonstrating with is a 36. So it's the more aggressive of the two. So if you're only going to get one, then go ahead and start with the more aggressive of the two. And if you're going to go for something like, my little fuzzy elephant head here, then just remember to put a longer fiber underneath. Our MC1 is pretty short, and when you fuzz it out, it might just feel like you've just unfelted it a little bit as opposed to giving it that furred appearance. So this really has a longer staple, like a 1-inch staple underneath. And MC1 is too, but it's so crimpy, it doesn't seem like it when you fuzz it out. A straighter fiber will feel a little more satisfying if you're trying to get a fuzzy appearance. What else can we answer?
Oh, Terry says, I'm so glad you're showing this. I can't wait to try the reverse needles. It's a beautiful effect.
They're pretty fun. So I really want to encourage you guys to just sort your own needles, see if you can figure out what they are. We're not going to be able to identify them for you over the phone, but we do carry lots of different sizes. I feel like I'm forgetting to tell you something, but I don't know what that is. So just find out, notice how it is that you like to sculpt, and think about felting needles as locking in a compression. So if you do sort of the rolling and compressing technique like I showed in the beginning, and then you felt from something compressed already, you'll have better results in starting with a very coarse needle and using the driving effect. Use your medium needles for shaping once you have that strong foundation in, or even adding layers on once you're satisfied with the density and base of whatever core you're making. So I guess the last thing might be, just super quick, would be if you're working in 2D. And we'll just look at one little picture I have here. This is a 2D picture that I've shared a few times, this little Boston. Now, he is needle felted with our MC1 batting on just to a felt sheet, just like I used here. But you can see how much of the wool comes through the backside. That's really natural for it to all come through. And I wanted to stay zoomed in here a little bit. The white, by the way, is the CX2, which is our winter white, bright white. But I wanted to stay zoomed in here a little bit so you can see, if you're giving this a magnifying glass, you are going to see some needle marks. But if you're viewing this like a picture is meant to be on the wall, you're not going to notice at all. And pretty much this entire thing is needle felted with a 42 triangle. And that's just my style. I want it to be nice and flat and compressed and able to be ironed. And you can go straight in or even like this. And then once you're all done and something is completely felted, then you can actually rub your fingers across it and not disturb the image. So you can use fine needles for an entire picture. It does go a little more slow, but if you really want to have a nice smooth finish on something, switch at some point to a very fine 42 needle. And I think if you're using something like our MC1 batting, it's going to needle felt very flat for you and actually be very, very satisfying. So, any final questions?
Yeah, Marie Claire asks a good question. She asks, does the fiber you work with influence which needles you should use or start with?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's kind of, I was touching on that a little bit. And I would say, no matter what, even if you have a coarser fiber, then a coarse needle is going to be a little more easy to grab onto it, and a fine needle is going to have a little more difficulty to grab onto it. So you may find if your fibers are a little more coarse, like over 32, you're going to lean towards coarser felting needles, but it's still going to help you to get the compression in place first. And I think the whole point of today's talk is that there's no really hard rule. You've got to pick up your needles that you have, poke it into what you have, the way you poke, and is it satisfying or it's not? Is it satisfying or it's not? So if it's not, you have a few different things you can do. You can grab another of the same needle and felt 2 at a time or 3 at a time, like we did with our cluster tool or our needle tools. And if that isn't satisfying, just notice, is it not satisfying because it's not grabbing any wool and being pushed off? If so, choose fewer needles or a finer needle. I hope that conveys, and I hope that does work kind of as a formula. So is it satisfying or not? Is it satisfying or not? And just try and pick up a different needle and see how that feels. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope this segment has been helpful. If it was, please leave us a comment down below and let us know what was your best takeaway from this session. Also, hit the subscribe button and be sure you hit that bell so you get notified every time we go live. But don't be shy. Join us live on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock Central over on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/livingfelt, and show us what you're felting in our group, Living Felt Friends, also on Facebook. And if you're looking for great shopping links for all kinds of felting supplies, just check the description down below. We have links for everything you need. So we'll see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.